Um, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Manjiao Chi. I'm a co-chair of the Asian Pacific Interest Group of American Society of International Law, ASIL. And together with my co-chair, Professor Matthew Iria of Oxford University, I'm here to welcome all of you, our distinguished speakers, moderator, and our audience. A very quick introduction of our interest group. The Asian Pacific Interest Group is one of the most active interest groups of the ASIL. The interest groups brings together lawyers, scholars, and others interested in the topic to inform each other of developments related to international law and international relations in and beyond the Asian Pacific region. And our interest group functions through panels and sessions at the ASIL annual meeting, and we hold a series of webinars on cutting-edge issues with a focus on the region. And we also publish an online newsletter featuring announcements and articles and essays written by our members. We also host events in joint sponsorship with our partner institutions. So today's webinar is our second webinar of this year, 2022, and we hope you'll interact with us, with our speakers, and enjoy the event. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor Craig Martin, the moderator for today's webinar, to introduce the webinar theme and our distinguished speakers. So Martin, Craig, sorry.
Thank you very much, Manjiao. So welcome everyone. As Manjiao mentioned, my name is Craig Martin. I'm a professor of law at Washburn University School of Law and also the co-director of the International and Comparative Law Center there. I'd like to begin by thanking Manjiao and Matt Erie, the two co-hosts of the Asia Pacific Interest Group of the American Society of International Law, for asking me to organize and moderate this panel. And thanks as well to Jimmy and to Wes and to Matt and all the other staff at ASIL who make these webinars possible. And finally, thanks to all of you for being here today. I know that it's both early or late wherever you are in the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts on Asian approaches to climate change and to moderate a discussion on what is, I think, an incredibly important topic. As I'm sure most of our audience will know, even since we announced this, the date of this webinar, the IPCC released the third of its reports for AR6 on mitigation, and it painted the direst picture yet for the challenge that confronts us in terms of keeping the temperature rise to below even 2 degrees Celsius. As you all know, some progress was made at Cop26, but many were disappointed by the failure to make more progress on many aspects of the agenda. And of course, the role of Asian countries in addressing climate change is crucial. China and India are now among the top 3 countries for greenhouse gas emissions, while at the same time, several Asian countries are also the most vulnerable to some of the worst effects of climate change and are the least able to adapt. What is more, there is considerable diversity in the different approaches being taken to climate change negotiations, as well as to their law and policy approaches to both mitigation and adaptation. So our purpose today is to hear from experts from a number of different Asian countries and to get the latest word as we prepare for COP27 on these different approaches and different perspectives in one of the most important regions of the world. So I'm going to introduce our speakers at the outset in the order in which they will speak. I'm going to keep the biographical information to a minimum so we can best spend our time on the substance. But you can, of course, look up each of them on their institutional websites. So speaking first will be Chaidan Chao, a lawyer and partner in the Gen law firm in California, who will speak to us about the Chinese approaches. Next, we will hear from Professor Shashikala Gupur, who is the Jean Monnet Professor of Law and the Dean of the Faculty of Law and the Director of the Law School at Symbiosis University in Pune, India, who will be discussing Indian approaches. Third, we will hear from Professor Yukari Takamura of the Institute of Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, and who is also the Vice President at the Science Council of Japan, who will, of course, discuss Japanese approaches and perspectives. And finally, Professor Margareta Werweneke Singh, who is in the Faculty of Law at Leiden University, but is also appointed at the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu, who will discuss the perspectives and approaches of the small island nations of the South Pacific. Each of our speakers will speak for between 10 and 12 minutes, and I will ring the alarm when their time is up. And we hope that there will be quite a bit of time for question and answer and discussion at the end. So I do encourage you all to remain till the end so that we can have a robust discussion. So with that, Ms. Kao.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Craig, and thank you for the invitation for ESO. I want to share my screen. Let me see here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, here is it. So today is, I'd love to firstly share the key points I'm gonna talk tonight. Firstly, I'll talk a little bit about the nationally determined contribution targets committed by China. And then under such a commitment, what kind of strategies and approaches adopted by Chinese government and to fulfill such commitment, and then what kind of policies and the legislation are adopted to, and how is the situation of enforcement of law, and what can be the challenges. Due to the time limits, so I probably give just very kind of overview of all those talk points. In terms of the NDC targets, the milestone for China to make such a commitment was that in 2015, China signed a Paris Agreement. So China made a commitment to peak carbon emissions around 2030. And then in September 2020, China further announced its ambition to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. In addition, China also made a commitment to lower the carbon intensity by over 65% by 2030 from the 2005 level, and increase the share of non-fossil fuels in energy consumption to 25% by 2030. So we can see, comparing those commitments made in 2015, the NDC targets in 2020 is much more ambitious. That also shows the determination of Chinese government to really take the climate change issue seriously and take its leadership role. And last September, China announced its decision to stop building coal power projects overseas. And so for the overall strategies of China to take for responding to climate change, there are many different approaches, but I'd love to highlight several, such as China established a national carbon trading market and made a target management system, and also made a big effort to promote the transition to green economy, and the regulations synergize the reduction of pollution and the carbon emissions. Of course, the government also allocated the resources and money, financial support to support the technology innovation and the green finance work. In terms of the policies for responding to climate change, firstly, from the very top level, Chinese central government adopted this, incorporated the NDC target into the National Economic and Social Development Plan. I think one of the most well-known plan is China's 14th five-year plan. So in this plan, China made a decision to reduce carbon intensity by 18% from 2020 to 2025. In addition, China established a mechanism of breaking down and meeting the target for responding to climate change. In detail, that means, firstly, the central government set a provincial level carbon emissions cap for each province. And this kind of a goal is binding for each province. And the performance of the government officials of in meeting such goal of controlling carbon emissions is very important reference for the appointment, reward, promotion, sanction, and the removal of government officials. So this policy aims to motivate the local governments to really make the best effort to mitigate climate change. And also one of the very important policy framework is the so-called 1+N policy framework. So it's a top-down policy framework. One means that the high-level policy adopted by the State Council under the guidance of the National Economic and Social Development Plan. And this one policy set up the long-term strategies and actions for climate change work. And N means the local governments and other departments under the State Council, they adopted the corresponding policies to fulfill or to meet the goal or the target set by the one policy. This policy framework regulates several important industries, such as energy, manufacturing, transport, agriculture, and so on. Furthermore, in 2018, Chinese central government made a restructure of the State Council. So the Ministry of Ecology and the Environment takes the lead instead of the National Development and Reform Commission. This is a sign which means the Chinese policy want to empower the MEE to take the leadership to combat climate change. That also means for the regulation tools, from the regulation perspective, the regulation of carbon dioxide might be regulated as just like, some other air pollutants prescribed in the air pollution prevention law. In addition, the central government established a national leading group headed by the premier of the State Council with government officials from 30 ministries and commissions as members. And the local government also established the corresponding groups. Another policy approach is the China considered the reduction of pollution and the carbon emissions as an integral part for responding to climate change. The reason behind this is China considered carbon dioxide and other pollutants often come from the same sources. That means the use and the consumption of fossil fuels. China also amended its law on the air pollution prevention law, and the newly amended law mandate regulators to coordinate control of air pollutants and the reduction of carbon emissions. So probably the law in China is a little bit different with, like, for instance, in the US. I know in the US law, CO2 is considered as air pollutants, but in China, it's still not the case. So the amendment of the law laid down the legal basis for the air pollutions to be regulated, by using those regulatory tools for regulating air pollutants. And in terms of the legislation, the laws and the regulations in China for mitigating climate change, unlike other countries, so far there is no unified climate change law, or there is no such statute. But those laws or those provisions concerning climate change work are distributed in different statutes, such as renewable energy law, law of conservation of energy, EIA law, or land law, forest law, etc. So the State Council put this legislative work on mitigating climate change on the agenda since 2016. According to the legislation plan of the State Council, China has been making effort to draft and maybe later to enact the climate change law. And also China is on the way of enacting the regulation on the administration of carbon emission trading. now there are some like department rules and administrative regulatory documents adopted by the departments under the State Council, and the local or those rules issued by the local provinces. So in terms of the law enforcement, there are two approaches for China to implement those policies, laws to mitigate climate change. The first approach is market-based approach. So since 2011, China selected 7 cities to launch its pilot projects for carbon emissions trading. Then based on the experience learning from those experimental areas, last year, China established its national carbon trading market. And at this moment, the electricity industry with around 2,000 companies is included or is mandated to participate in the national carbon trading market. The MEE also issued administration rules and the guidelines and adopted a quota allocation plan for those companies participating in the national carbon trade market. MEE, in terms of the legislative effort from MEE, it recently, since in the most recent 2 years, it issued several guidelines and department rules. And now the legislative effort is move forward to making the interim regulation on the administration of carbon emission trading. In terms of the command and respond approach, MEE, Ministry of Ecology and the Environment, and the national another department under the State Council, NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission. These two departments are the main regulators for handling the climate change work. The MEE adopted take very stringent regulation on mandating on regulating, restricting those high energy consuming and the high emissions projects in order to address the carbon neutrality. And the NDRC adopt the dual control system, which means control the energy consumption intensity for the industry and the companies, and also control the total amount of the energy consumption in order to address the carbon neutrality. So in terms of the challenge, based on my experience as a lawyer and also my previous experience engaging in the legislative work, I think the challenges for China to combat climate change comes from the following perspective. Firstly, the climate policies and the regulatory measures have big impact on business activities. Unfortunately, for the private sector, they are not so well prepared. I think probably we all know the shortage of energy happened last year, not only in China, but also in Europe, in many other countries. So that case showed those private sectors, they are not prepared for such thing happen. Actually, for climate change regulation, China has adopted or has taken measures since 2011, much earlier than 2011. But that time, before 2020, before the announcement of the commitment to reach carbon neutrality by 2060, the Chinese regulators, the regulation of the Chinese regulators are not so stringent, or much stringent comparing before. So that's why the private sectors, they are not so aware of this strict, very stringent regulation. And for the government on the legislator and the regulator side, I think it's very hard for China to really reach a balance between the development of a renewable energy happened, the energy shortage last year, and also the balance between the interest of the central government and the local government from this region to another region, and also the balance between the short-term goal and medium goal and the long-term goal. So due to time limit, so I just give some like very brief sharing. Maybe we can go deeper later in the Q&A side. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Professor Gopur, if we could hear from the Indian perspective, please.
Good evening, one and all. It's my pleasure to address all of you with the kind permission from the chair, Professor Craig Martin. At the outset, as I share my PowerPoint presentation, I have a lot of data and details, unlike the clean, clear presentation by my colleague from China. But I must tell you all that our problems are common and our exploration of solution also look very similar. One of the common problems that I could say from Indian experience is that we do lack a unified legislation on climate change. So for us, climate change is a kind of veering between socioeconomic condition and adverse impact on the environment, as the Chinese colleague said about the challenge in the business, So similar problems we face. However, when we are talking of promise of clean energy and finances to tackle the environmental impact, which is about committing 500 billion by 2025, as it was evident in COP26, where do we stand as a country in Asia is another issue I would like to highlight. Aside from that, the international law question of accountability of state in terms of intentional wrongful act of harming the environment and the casualty that it causes, and what is the standard of conduct, how do we define damage, all these questions loom large, and we have dealt these questions at the domestic level, and we have been both at the risk level of being vulnerable to the impact of climate change, such as sea erosion or disasters or flash floods, and on the side also of being one of the most, one of the greenhouse gases emitting countries in the third rank. The other issue is the scientific complexity in terms of what kind of issues need to be prioritized and how to be handling those issues. So if you look at the Environmental Performance Index of India, in terms of overall environmental performance index ranking, India is in 168 in comparison to China in 120, Japan in 12, South Korea in 28, and Indonesia in 118. So overall environmental performance indicator makes India stand with 27.6 kind of score. In the global ranking as well, it's 106. And score for climate change also is something that could be improved. So if
Professor Gopur, if I could just interrupt for a sec, I'm wondering if it might be helpful if you could just put your PowerPoint in slideshow view.
Slide share? Okay, I could do that. Thank you. So if we are looking at key indicators in India as a percentage of global averages between 2000 and 2019, some of the indicators such as GDP per capita, energy demand per capita, oil demand per capita, it has risen substantially. And energy needs of India is one of the largest, global emitters of carbon dioxide behind China and US, although there is a low per capita CO2 emission, which means that the hope is very much there in green lifestyles and in approaches. Now, this is exactly India's commitment in COP26, in Prime Minister's articulation of life, which is environment friendly. And we have also seen that Indian cities have engaged in international climate cooperation, where they have looked at seeking innovative solutions to address the energy, water, and infrastructure problems, as scholarly observations have revealed. Now, I will divert the attention of the audience to India's stance at COP26. India's new goal, according to one of the experts, is a kind of bold, ambitious goal, and it is also a challenge for the rest of the world. Now, Prime Minister spoke about life as a mantra, here life in terms of sustainable lifestyle, and he also spoke of the fivefold, the Panchamritas. Amrit means nectar. So he's talking about not only adding to the, not only preventing the addition to the greenhouse gases, but it is about paying debt for others' addition to the greenhouse gases. It's not just India's burden, but it is a global burden which India needs to handle. So another point we saw was COVID-19 in a way reduced our resilience to climate change. Therefore, when the stimulus was introduced, it was more about green recovery, and it was a climate-friendly stimulus that was introduced in the COVID-19, post-COVID-19 recovery period. Although India has been lambasted as the third highest polluter, its addition has been 2.88 megatons compared to 5 or 3 times higher of the other 2 lead countries, and given the billions of population. So the Panchamrit dimension which the Prime Minister gave include these important points. One is non-fossil energy capacity to 500 GWs or gigawatts by 2030. So green energy transition plan is very much in hold with this. And then what we are looking at is, it is the highest green energy transition plan. Secondly, it's about 50% of its energy requirement coming from renewable energy by 2030, which is another ambitious agenda, and reducing the total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now onwards till 2030. By 2030, to reduce carbon intensity of its economy by at least up to 45%, and by 2070, India to achieve target of net zero. Now, this is something that looks very, very promising, but it is not just an empty promise. How are we embarking on this journey? What kind of legal framework do we have in India? India has got a constitution which has lasted for last 7+ decades. And under the constitution, we have articulated under fundamental rights, the most sacrosanct right of protection of life and liberty. And within life, we include life with quality and livelihood. So climate change has got a direct bearing in terms of this sacrosanct right. And Article 19, which is about the freedom of trade, business, and profession and occupation, has got some kind of a conflicting relationship, as it was revealed in the Chinese case as well. And Article 32, 226, which speak about judicial intervention in case there is an endangerment of this right. And rest of the articles that I'm talking about here in terms of commitment to protect the environment with the totality of forests and wildlife, and improving the natural environment, or if it is the question of legislation to give effect to these do not come in the justiciable part of fundamental rights. Now, that is the difference that one has to see. So how have Indian courts and policymakers and legislation continued this commitment regarding the climate change mitigation is the question to be asked, which I'm going to highlight. Now, there are a number of Indian legislations which are, again, generically, Environmental Protection Act of 1986 lays down these provisions, which gives power to the central or the federal government. However, the provincial governments are the ones which are at the level of implementation. So in terms of Cop26 commitments, how does it look like? I will give you some examples within the limitations of time. We have the legislation on biological diversity, fishery, river boards, merchant shipping, Water Pollution Control Act, Air Pollution Control Act, Atomic Energy Act, which have some kind of climate connection. But these are tenuous connections. There is no cohesive, unified legislation as it was told in the case of China. So this is our common pain area. Now, if you look at the ministries also, there are many silos here. There is Ministry of Forest, Environment and Climate Change at the federal government level, and state ministries are all environment ministries, except state of Gujarat, which is Prime Minister's home state, which has got separate ministry for climate change. And recently we have come out with separate ministry for water, Ministry of Jal Shakti. We have Ministry of Fisheries, Agriculture, New and Renewable Energy, House and Urban Affairs. So these ministries are requiring to be unified in their operation. And the agencies such as National Green Tribunal, which is a kind of judicial body where the litigation has been outsourced to this body with multidisciplinary panel, which is a very, very innovative structure as far as dispute resolution is concerned in India. And its reflections and decisions are ensuring that India is always realigning its commitment to the various international conventions in this area. So we have other agencies such as Biodiversity Authority at the state and national level, Pollution Control Boards, Tiger Conservation Authority, Animal Welfare Board, Forest Survey of India. And then we have very vibrant civil society organizations like Greenpeace, Center for Science and Environment, and Naudanya, which is headed by Dr. Vandana Shiva, Wildlife Protection Society of India, among others. Now, if you look at the initiatives which are taken in India to protect climate and to mitigate adverse impact of climate change, the very first one was launched in 2008, the National Action Plan which had different missions to implement it. Once again, we have subcommittee kind of culture here, where we have solar mission. For enhanced energy efficiency, we have a mission. Sustainable habitat, we have a mission. And we have a skill development program, compensatory afforestation fund, education. So it's in the range of preventive, capacity building, strengthening, and uniquely focused fragile ecosystems as well. Now, international conventions which have been ratified in India, which have been ratified by India, have direct nexus with these different agencies and ministries, and that's how we translate our international commitments for implementation. However, in playing a very direct and proactive role, I could bring before you the work of National Green Tribunal, which in its recent decisions in last 5 years, particularly in 2017 and 2019, I'm quoting 2 decisions there, regarding unauthorized construction. It referred to the destruction of carbon sinks, carbon dioxide emissions, and from the forest loss, and localized warming effects of small-scale deforestation. So this kind of a localized reflection on climate change is a very, very innovative and forward-looking idea, which again got translated in Prime Minister's commitment at COP26 in terms of localized solution and ecosystem or climate justice. Second decision which came was Hanuman Lakshmana decision in 2019, where construction of a new airport was suspended by our highest court, namely the Supreme Court, saying that statutory process was not followed, the environmental impact assessment and other processes. So there the court cited several international legal instruments in the decision and sustainable development goals, the Paris Agreement, and India's nationally determined contribution, the NDC commitments. So this is how it is a judiciary which has been bringing back the pendulum to swing back to the international commitments. So in the light of this, the next question that the panel is supposed to discuss is roadmap for COP26 commitments as far as India is concerned. India needs to combine the emission reduction with climate adaptation, and needs to embed environmental justice and also to protect activists who are working towards environmental justice in a stronger democratic framework. And environmental justice for people and nature need to look at investing in disaster preparedness, and justice measures need to look at social protection mechanisms and citizens as agents of change as well, with democratic deliberation and data. Now, data is something that needs to be consolidated further. This is where technology needs to be used, and we need to have very competent technology. And in a collaborative international environment, this could be possible to deliver decarbonization and development. Second one is about climate finance, and there is regulatory mechanism by the center, but then at the subnational level, in the provincial level, as I told you, and the local voices and players, how do they come in? There is a $1.4 trillion additional foreign support needed with the geopolitical diversity of India. I'll give you the examples of 4 states. One is state of Maharashtra, where my law school is located. It's one of the biggest states. It is focusing with the current ministry on ecosystem restoration, urban resilience, because Mumbai is the city which is with the highest population density, sustainable transportation and climate governance, and looking at institutional capacity to enhance green finance. So they have identified 43 Amrit cities to achieve it. I mean, this number is much bigger than the number that the Chinese colleague was talking about as far as China was concerned. And this goal is in tandem with the goal that Prime Minister has committed in COP26. Second is state of Chhattisgarh, which comes in the vulnerable states. And here livelihood dependence is very much on agriculture, forest conservation, and decarbonizing industry and transportation. So there is a cross-sectoral initiative in this state. In Orissa, another vulnerable state, climate budget received international finance for Green Climate Fund. Very interesting. And it had to build resilience because it is the normal destination facing the twin challenge of tropical cyclone as well as drought. Then we have state of Bihar, which is in partnership with the UNEP for low carbon development and resilience roadmap. So these are all the localized attempts, provincial attempts to meet the ambitions. As far as Delhi is concerned, phasing down of coal power and inefficient fuel subsidies and focus on human health and carbon neutrality by 2025 as the imminent goal has been taken. And in Jammu and Kashmir, local capacity building for protecting the water resources, horticulture and agriculture, which is the lifeline of the people, has been focused. So this is how we see that the deliverance of the commitment is forthcoming at the provincial and local level. And other players, if you are looking at, in terms of corporate India, the homegrown industries are now looking at innovative and inclusive green development. More than the public sector companies, the private sectors are outperforming. For example, Reliance recently outsourced and acquired a particular type of technology. So looking at Swadeshi practices in big players and small players is one thing, and micro and small manufacturing industries are looking at manufacturing e-vehicles, but with a lot of incentive by the government. Indian business houses need to be looking at the global players, and they can look at some best practices. In terms of innovation for energy transition and climate action, there is a national level board created with the Ministry of Science and Technology, BIRAC, and there are also innovation related policies which are coming up, but they can be more efficient, and they could look at efficiency improvement, particularly in the thermal plant, because our thermal plants are operating at subcritical level compared to Japan or other countries. We need to also look at collaboration with developed countries in terms of climate change supportive technology transfer, financing, taxation, and capacity building with best practices. Quickly, I will take you through some of those points.
Professor Gupur, if I could just ask you to very quickly conclude, because we do want to leave lots of time for questions.
So I would suggest that India needs to look at way forward in terms of crafting strategic climate litigation, as we mentioned earlier. Lack of climate-specific legislation in terms of unified legislation needs to be there. We could look at best practices in the Netherlands and climate change legislation in the US, in Pakistan in terms of climate policies, and the climate politics, etc., to be bridging the silos, and to look at a proactive planning and execution than reactive decision making, and a kind of coordinated climate governance at India's institutional arrangement, and thereby we could really translate the promises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So next we will hear from Professor Takamura from Japan. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Craig, and also Manjao, to invite me to speak in this webinar. That is great pleasure and honored. So my role is that they present a Japanese approach for climate change. As you might know, that the Japanese, current goal of the 2050 is the net zero by 2050, reduce greenhouse gases, gas emission in Japan to net zero. So this pledge, net zero by 2050, is now added as a fundamental idea or principle to the 1998 law on the combating against global warming by its 2020 amendment, so that it's already the goal under the law. And also the Japan already submitted the nationally determined contribution 2030 climate target. So as you might know, that 46% by 2030, below 2030 level. Previously it was 26%, then the almost double level. So the current Japanese emission trend is quite, promising, if I may, because based on the 2030 emission level, now we are around the 80% below 2030 in 2020. So if this trend will continue around the 2030, our emission reduction level would reach above 40%. Below 2013. Before talking about the current, features of the climate law and changing approach, of the climate law and policy, I'd like to briefly talk about general features so far of the climate law and policy. First point that I like to highlight is always development of Japanese climate law and policy have been driven by international development of climate policy. So that means that the motivation or driver does not exist, unfortunately, at the domestic level. I mean, domestic driver is so weak. The second feature of climate law and policy so far is that they quite a piecemeal and a kind of compilation of measures taken and planned by relevant minister, and the plan, in a sense that I could say that plan of patchwork type of law and policies. So we gather the policy and measures planned by relevant ministry, then the ministry negotiate, then create they create a climate target, kind of bottom-up approach, and say more, or say how to say, the progressive approach to decide a climate target. But at this time, based on the net zero by 2050 and also 2030 climate target aligned with the net zero goal by 2050, it is actually the first time that the energy policy framed based on the long-term climate goal and the 2030 climate target. So firstly, the government decided the long-term goal, and then the 2030 climate target. And within that framework, or within that context, new basic energy plan just approved by Cabinet, October 2021, was elaborated and approved. That's quite a drastic change in terms of the policy making climate policy making in Japan. So the third features is that we do not see many intervention of law in climate actions. Very weak legalization is one of the unfortunate features of climate law and policy in Japan. So the measure and policy are mainly voluntary. Maybe the only, say, the obligation, especially for the private entity, is that the reporting of their emission. So beside it, the most, the policy and measure are voluntary, and if even with this reporting obligation, only that's actually based on the 1997 energy conservation law, but the energy efficiency benchmark fixed for each major business sectors, but has not equipped with the strong enforcement. So of course, that caused a problem of effectiveness, even the equity or equitable allocation of effort and legitimacy problem. Then but unfortunately, it's not yet well settled, even after the net zero goal by 2050 and 2030 climate target. So big change actually coming, especially coming from, institutionally speaking, coming from the long-term target, because setting the long-term target officially, that's create a basis for the more integral elaboration and implementation of policy. So I already referred to the first time event of the new energy basic strategic energy plan, which was decided based on the climate goal instead of the bottom-up approach to create a climate goal, climate target so far. This long-term goal also encourage the private sector to take more aggressive climate action and incentivize innovation and investment. This long-term goal have then quite an important role to change the course of Japanese climate law and policy. The second change in the climate law and policy is, I think it's quite similar with the Professor Gapu, and Japanese climate policy now considered as a part of stimulus package for green and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19. And climate policy, of course, it's a part of environmental policy and law, but it is also considered that the stimulus to create a green growth, especially to adapt the changing market toward decarbonization. For instance, that is one of the important policy document. It's not a law, but this green growth strategy set a 14 focal area. They are the area that will become hopefully a promising area to make a transformational change in industry and economy for future to come. So that is the second features. The third, I think, which is maybe most important, is that internalization and the mainstreaming of climate-related risk consideration in business strategy and decision-making. I think such phenomenon is now occurring in every part of the countries, other countries as well. But that is, for Japan, it's really, important driver to encourage the business to take the lead for the ambitious or aggressive climate actions. So it's very, why the business takes such kind of lead. Of course, they recognize the increasing risk of climate change. And also the second point is that the supply chain actually encourage the company encourages its supplier to change the behavior and to take a more aggressive climate action. Actually, that kind of impact firstly come from the global companies such as Microsoft and Apple. As you know, that these companies encourage or request its supplier to they take, the more aggressive climate action. For instance, in this case of Apple, as you might know, that, Apple requests its supplier to make its use of power to the renewable source by 2030. So already more than 1,200 manufacturer partners, including 29 Japanese companies, have committed actually the 100% renewable energy for Apple production. So then the pressure comes from the supply chain, and also the come from the financial sectors. Now, as you know, that with the ESG investing, that means that the investor consider that how the company take, what kind of action take toward the decarbonization. That is one of the important criteria for their investing. So with, as you might know, that now the disclosure guidance is provided by the task force created under the G20 and called the TCFD. And also now we see some kind of more integration of the international sustainability standard disclosure, disclosure standard by in the private sector. So with that, I think countries, I mean, Japan government, not only I think that Japan, but also other government encourage and legislate some action to encourage such kind of disclosure and the ESG investing. And then maybe last point that I like to say that with these elements and the narrative has actually changed. Climate action is a cost, but maybe for short term, but now the company and the policy maker focus on the climate action may bring multiple benefit maybe the reducing air pollution and creating the employment and others, so that actually changed the narrative. So the last that maybe I like to discuss in this webinar, because Japan, of course, how to make an energy transition is quite important. I think it's quite a common sense for all countries. But in light of the situation of our Japanese policy, climate law and policy, there are several challenges, specific, and maybe common with other countries. First, Japan has only very weak and low-level carbon pricing. I understand that the EU now prepare for the CBAM, and that is a kind of, say, raising the level of carbon pricing and diffuse this kind of measure to other countries. So how we could see from Japan and also from other Asian countries and Pacific countries. Innovation policy, of course, how to encourage or induce the new innovation. That is another point. And also international cooperation is very much important. We know that now the carbon market is ready under the Paris Agreement, Article 6. So how we see the development, how this carbon market contribute to the decarbonization in Asian Pacific region. Last not but least, for instance, sustainability disclosure, it's not in the forum on the public sphere of the climate change, such as the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. This kind of standard is discussed and created in the private sector. So now the climate change consideration to going into the other area of law and policy, then maybe at the national level and the international level, how to elaborate and implement laws and policy in more integral and consistent way, how to settle and solve some kind of discrepancy between them. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Professor Wewaranki Singh from Leiden University, speaking to us about the South Pacific and the small island states.
Thank you so much, Craig. And it's a big pleasure to be here with you all today. So my presentation is going to be probably slightly different because the perspective of Pacific Island nations is really quite different from that of the bigger Asian economies. So to start with, it's estimated that the Pacific Island nations together contribute about 0.03% to global emissions. That's almost nothing. So what Pacific Island states do in terms of mitigation is largely symbolic. And they do take that symbolic role very seriously. So we do see Pacific Island nations putting forward some of the most ambitious NDCs of the world, of course, in terms of what it actually does to combat climate change. It's a drop in the ocean, you can say. But in terms of symbolic leadership, it does, I think, show the rest of the world that the Pacific practices what it preaches and is willing also to themselves contribute to what should really be a global transition. Now, there are three issues I would like to discuss in this brief presentation. The first is mitigation ambition, the second is finance, and the third issue is loss and damage. So to start with ambition, of course, for the Pacific, climate change is an existential threat already. So a country like the Solomon Islands has already lost 5 islands that have been completely swallowed by the sea. Communities have been relocated in Fiji, for example, in Papua New Guinea. Entire villages have been relocated to safer areas because the areas where they traditionally lived were no longer livable. Monster cyclones strike the Pacific now regularly. such as Cyclone Pam, which struck Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Fiji in 2015. And for Vanuatu, for example, the damage amounted to 67% of its GDP. So that is very severe damage. And then we're not even talking about the non-economic losses. And that was 2015. And then in 2019, another Category 5 cyclone struck Vanuatu. So while Vanuatu was still recovering from the previous cyclone, another cyclone that was equally strong hit and again devastated the entire communities. Now, for the Pacific, a critical issue internationally in the negotiations is the agreement on the long-term temperature goal of keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to keep them below 1.5 degrees. Now, the Pacific would very much have liked to see an unambiguous commitment to a 1.5 degree temperature goal, because for low-lying island nations like the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tokelau, and the same goes for the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, this is really an existential target. So more than 1.5 degree of warming means that these nations will be almost certainly completely uninhabitable. They'll be wiped out. And there is, of course, no agreement or indication of where the inhabitants of the island nations should go in the event that their territory would be lost. So this 1.5 degree goal is really critical for the Pacific. And so the Pacific fought tooth and nail in Paris to get that temperature goal incorporated in the Paris Agreement. And the result was the language that we now have in Article 2.1a, with pursuing efforts to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, we are absolutely not on track for keeping temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. The window of opportunity for meeting that goal is rapidly closing. Some are starting to say that it's already has already become impossible. But somebody like UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is telling us and the world that the target is still achievable, but it is on life support. And so that means that to meet the target, we really have to get our act together as a global community and turn the tides immediately. And so the Paris Agreement, as we all know, builds on voluntary pledges, right? There was the Kyoto Protocol, which was a model of legally binding emission reduction commitments, and the Paris Agreement changed that and allows or requires all countries to put forward their pledges, which are nationally determined. And the idea is that there's a ratchet mechanism, and so countries put forward increasingly ambitious NDCs in line with the global temperature goal. Now, Cop26 in Glasgow was the first big test for the Paris Agreement and its ratchet mechanism to see whether it really worked, because countries had to put forward new and updated NDCs, right? And so that happened to an extent, but it's clear that the ratchet mechanism, in terms of its ability to catalyze action in line with the global temperature goals, failed. It failed the test. Why? Because we're still on track for about 2.7 degrees of warming. That's the end of the Pacific. So more is needed to make sure that the Paris Agreement delivers the ambition that it states in Article 2.1a. And so an achievement in that sense for the Pacific and the world, we can say, is that the world, in a way, countries get a new opportunity to put forward revised NDCs for those countries that have not already done so. The countries, just to put a spotlight on them, are Australia, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, the Philippines, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, Tunisia, and Vietnam. All need to put forward new and more ambitious NDCs to try and close what has been called the Glasgow credibility gap. Now, what exactly do we mean by the Glasgow credibility gap? Well, we have a lot of commitments from many different countries now about achieving net zero emissions by mid-century. But to really achieve that and to meet the long-term temperature goal, we also know that we need to halve emissions by 2030. And so to achieve that, we need much more ambition. Right now, we have about 25% of the ambition required to achieve that. So that means we need more ambitious pledges. Of course, that also requires getting rid of our fossil fuel addiction, as again, to quote Secretary General Guterres. And so what was interesting about COP26 in Glasgow as well was that for the first time there was a very explicit discussion about fossil fuels, and there is language for the first time on fossil fuels in the official outcome. Now, there has been a lot of talk about the role of India, supported by China, in what has been said, weakening the language on coal in the outcome text. So in a draft text, there was it was said that the use of unabated coal and subsidies for fossil fuels needed to be phased out. And then India made a proposal from the floor to say that phased out was unacceptable and it should be phased down. Now, India was widely criticized for that, and from the Pacific there was also some hard feelings. A representative from the Marshall Islands said, for example, that it accepted with great this particular change of this one word with great reluctance, because other elements in a Glasgow package represented a lifeline for the Marshall for the Marshallese people. So in other words, there was no choice, but it was unacceptable. So that seems as if the Pacific and Asia were just right on the complete opposite ends of the spectrum. However, perhaps that is not exactly, perhaps it's not exactly as it appears to be there, because in the end, the positions of the Pacific and the big Asian economies do converge when it comes to the underlying issue that you can say caused India to object and caused China to support India in this here, and that is equity and finance. So we know in the Climate Change Convention, it says in Article 4.7 that essentially the contributions of developing countries to climate action are conditional upon support in the form of technology transfer and finance to developing countries. And of course, even the Paris Agreement is adopted under the UNFCCC, so that provision is still, you can argue, applicable. And so we also know as far back as in 2009 in Copenhagen, developed countries pledged to provide $100 billion annually in climate finance to developing countries. Now, that hasn't been delivered, and regret was expressed officially about that in Glasgow. But developed countries, most developed countries, I should say, pledged to try and meet that goal. And in the meantime, parties also agreed to launch a work program on a new collective quantified goal for post-2025 finance. So this 100 billion is to be provided annually until 2025. And then after 2025, there needs to be a new goal. And then here, developing countries, and that includes the bigger developing countries, as well as the Pacific, they all argue that the new goal must be needs-based. 100 billion was not in any way linked to developing countries' real needs. It was a political goal that Hillary Clinton and her staff probably made up at the time in 2009. So what developing countries are saying is we need to look at what we need, and that is what needs to be the basis for this new target. And so now needs assessments have started, and for the first time evidence is being collected at what developing countries actually need. And clearly the needs are huge and far exceed 100 billion US dollars annually. Now, the finance that we are talking about here is about finance for mitigation as well as for adaptation. And this was also a big debate, as we all know, in Glasgow, because the lion's share of finance is provided for mitigation. Only a small fraction goes to adaptation. And developing countries are all saying this portion of finance that should be provided for adaptation should be much larger. And so developing countries managed to highlight the importance of adaptation by putting it upfront in the text. So the language on adaptation is before the language on mitigation, and also the agreement explicitly commits to achieving a 50-50 split for adaptation and mitigation finance, and to double the amount of adaptation finance provided. And finally, the very last minute of this short presentation, I want to go to the issue of loss and damage. So when we talk about, for example, the losses and damages suffered by a country like Vanuatu as a result of a cyclone amounting to 67% of GDP, right now, no finance is really being provided through the climate regime for such loss and damage. What Vanuatu receives, and the same goes for all developing countries, what they receive to deal with those impacts is can be anything, and it's always less than what is needed, and it's provided as a matter of charity or humanitarian aid. There's no structured program for ensuring that developing countries, including countries that have contributed very little to climate change, can actually deal with the impact. So in other words, the burden of paying for the impact of climate change is on the victims, not on the polluters. So developing countries have long pushed for finance to address loss and damage. And here in Glasgow, developing countries, including all the big Asian economies, as well as the Pacific and the small climate vulnerable countries, they all united as one front and said, we want to see a loss and damage financial facility, so that we are able to pay for those costs and the burden is not on us. Now, this was not achieved. Instead of that, the parties agreed to hold a Glasgow dialogue on finance for loss and damage. And so that means there will be 2 more years of talk, probably very little action. So it's in June this year that this Glasgow dialogue will kick off, and that it's set to conclude in June 2024 at SB60. And developing countries have made it clear that they expect that the outcome of this dialogue will be that this Glasgow, the financial facility for loss and damage is established with funding that is to be additional to adaptation and mitigation funding. And if that doesn't happen, many Pacific countries have already announced they will look outside the regime and are prepared to address the issue through judicial bodies. I will leave it at this and very much look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all very much for this really interesting discussion or presentations, and I'm looking forward to some discussion. And maybe I'll sort of use the prerogative of the moderator to kick things off. And so I guess a question I would put to all of you, or in particular the first three of you, because we've heard the divergence sort of in perspective from the small island states as compared to the large economies of Asia. And I think one got the sense from listening to these presentations that this wasn't sort of an optimistic view of the commitments and plans for each of the respective countries. But if I can play the devil's advocate for a moment and be somewhat a bit more pessimistic, and I just want to sort of perhaps kick off the discussion by sharing the screen. So this is the very well-known climate action tracker, which assesses the performance of a number of leading countries in the context of climate change, and assesses their policies in relation to the targets under the Paris Climate Agreement. So, for example, we see China, which is rated as highly insufficient. Its net zero target, it can't be rated because there's incomplete data. But most importantly, when we look at the graph, we see where its current policies are trending relative to the 1.5 target. It's sort of looking at, it would lead to a 3-degree world, which, as Margareta indicated, would be absolutely catastrophic for countries in the Pacific. And India is in a similar situation. It's not highly rated as highly insufficient. Its policies are well above the 1.5-degree target. And of course, I don't mean to pick on China and India. I mean, Japan is slightly better. The United States is slightly better, but not much. And so the bottom line is the leading economies in the world are all failing in achieving the targets. And so you've given us the sort of the optimistic view of all of the work that is being done and the commitments that are being made and the extent to which some of these pledges are being realized. But the objective view is that we are all failing and we're not on track to meet the 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC report, the latest, the third of the reports for AR6 confirmed that. So I guess I'm going to ask you to be a bit more critical in the discussion and sort of lead off perhaps the question with, in your view, if you had to point to the one or two most critical weaknesses in your country's approach to climate change and what it ought to do to try in the run-up to COP27 to change course, to bring its policies more in line with the ambitions of the Paris Climate Agreement and COP26, what would it be? So maybe we can perhaps go in reverse order. So Takamoto-sensei, maybe we can begin with you.
Thank you, Craig.
And if I may, just Margareta, maybe I'll leave you at the end to sort of pile back on with the sort of critical view, but we'll get the large economies first with Takamoto-sensei.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. You're totally right. I talked a lot of the focusing on the positive aspect of the recent development of climate, Japan's climate law and policies, but that is all in the paper. So that how to implement this policy and measure is quite, of course, it is critical. And without that, I think we could not, raise the level of ambition and beyond 2030 or even by 2030. So I think 2 points, if I may refer to as a critical weak point is, one is a very low carbon pricing at domestic level. And we have, say, the properly in a specific carbon tax is only $3 per 1 ton carbon equivalent. So it's very low. Of course, there are some charge on the energy use and others, but it's not really in proportion with the carbon emissions. That is, I think, one big problem. Without that, we cannot, for instance, renewable cannot compete with the existing coal-fired plant. So the energy transition never happened in the market. So that is one. And the second is more, as I said, that now the target, yes, on the table, but implementation is much more difficult in the sense that based on the quite a big sectionalism of the government. So that how to make, how to make or elaborate policy measures and implement on the ground in the real collaboration between the ministries and also the national level and the local level. I think that is two critical points for our more effective implementation of climate policies. Yeah, with that, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gupur.
Yeah,
thank you for the question. Would you like
oh, yeah, please.
thank you. Yeah, would you please? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to share a little bit about my view on the difficult part or the challenges faced by China for responding to climate change, and also say to what perspective it's kind of a failure. I think firstly, China has been always struggling between this economic development and carbon emissions control. China had, because of this centralized administration system, so China tried to design or try to adopt kind of a unified approach to regulate, for instance, what I mentioned before in my presentation, to allocate the quota of energy consumption, or allocate the quota or break down the targets of controlling of carbon emissions to different promises. However, in this process, we face several issues. So how big is the emission of the whole country, right? Secondly, so how to allocate the quota in a more scientific way and a more reasonable way, because for some regions in China, for instance, in the eastern part of China, there are not so many industries like a high energy or energy intensive industry, but in like west part of China, maybe that's different story. So how to allocate this target and distribute such quota, and second issue is how to monitor and track the carbon emissions. Before, like in the past years, what I mentioned in 2018, the restructure of the department under the State Council, the leadership of doing climate change work moved from like the role kind of a change a little bit from the NDRC to MEE. So before that, how Chinese regulators to calculate the carbon emission, usually they just calculate the energy consumption, right, from different industries, different companies. So they calculate how much energy they used, and then they calculate how much carbon emissions. That's kind of a very rough approach. And now the MEE tried to shift this dual control on energy consumption and energy consumption intensity and the total amount to be carbon emission intensity and the total amount. However, whether China has good technology or has good enough technology to track the emission of those industries, and the companies, and to have like on-time monitoring technology or equipment to do that. Otherwise, it's very hard, right? So then how to really to design this this carbon emission system from technology perspective, from scientific perspective. Why I raise this particular issue? Because as a lawyer, I handled some like administrative cases for my clients because of this target allocated by the central government in terms of the energy consumption quota or the carbon emission quota. So sometimes the enterprise, this quota will break it down from central government to province and to cities, to municipalities, to cities, and then to industry, to companies. So my client come to me and say, how do I know I have this, I'm allowed to to have this amount of carbon emission. This is allowed. Well, based on what? So in those administrative lawsuits, so we file the lawsuit, we question the government how to calculate this. It's very difficult for them to answer. So you see, for this perspective, I'm kind of like, from technology perspective, I'm kind of questioning how to really make this this happen, or make this work better. Yeah, so this is something I wanted to raise. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Professor Gupur, one or two critical points for Indian policy.
What I think is, I mean, almost a similar problem in Japan and China in terms of domestic compliance. You know, being a big nation and home to a big population, with the geopolitical diversity impinging upon climate change, what I see is what I emphasized in my presentation: a data-driven kind of approach in carbon reduction, and also watchfulness, lifestyle changes at the popular level in energy consumption, localized solutions, and a cohesive policy, a cohesive law, which will incorporate all these diversities. Like, for example, now I gave the example of Reliance. In Pune, we had water shortage because of huge construction coming up, because a lot of industrialization and a lot of diversion from Mumbai of the population. So some of the builders have brought in internationally adopted technology in terms of waterless construction. So such local solutions, which could be driven by private sector, also could be solutions. In terms of responsibility of these developing big economies to the smaller nations in the Pacific is something that I was thinking about. I think in the international negotiation tables, these will have to be looking at displacement and rehabilitation costs as a global responsibility, and more funding to be coming about faster in terms of adaptation to climate change. So these are some of the quick ideas that I could share with you. Thank you.
Margaretha, you have a different perspective on this?
Well, I thought I can perhaps take a step back and highlight a little bit the perspective from two other regimes, the human rights regime and the SDG regime. So as we all know, preambular paragraph 11 of the Paris Agreement highlights states' obligations to respect, protect, fulfill and promote human rights, and also the importance of a just transition. And of course, there's also the Sustainable Development Goals. So we talk about the need to halve carbon emissions by 2030. There's another very important 2030 commitment in the SDGs, which is in SDG 7, universal access to clean and sustainable energy for everyone. And so this is also, again, a challenge that the Pacific and many big Asian economies have in common, to make sure that those, especially poor people living in rural areas, have access to energy that is also clean. And so, again, this is a global challenge that will require much more global solidarity to address this challenge. So not only tackling climate change, but also lifting people out of poverty. And so here we have, of course, in SDG 17, a commitment to a global partnership for sustainable development. We have in the Climate Change Convention, the commitments to transfer technologies, to provide the finance. It's exactly the same finance discussion that we are having. So, and there, in the margins of the COP, unfortunately, not really at the negotiation table, more in the space of the side events. There were very interesting discussions about, for example, a global feed-in tariff. So many developed countries, some developing countries are already managing to promote renewable energy through feed-in tariffs. So you shift funding away from the dirty sources and you put it towards the renewables, so investing in research and development and scaling up and deployment, etc. If that is done at a global level, you can make much more progress much faster. So let me conclude by highlighting this need for solidarity and the need to think more boldly and creatively as a global community about the solutions that we need to meet these targets by the deadlines, which are really around the corner.
Thank you very much. So we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, or a few questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but one from William Nager, who's actually a student of mine at Washburn, asks, how is development in the decarbonized direction disrupted by the very damage that unmitigated climate change is already causing? So we have this sort of feedback loop issue. Perhaps if we can do a whirlwind, if a couple of you have 20-second response, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, I think. Sakamoto-sensei, you want to lead us off? I saw you nodding.
Thank you. I wish to raise a hand, but I couldn't find. But thank you very much for the question, Mr. Professor Wellham. So I think there are two directions. And first, the assistance, as many of the speakers talked, and especially we are facing the very high fuel price, which caused, of course, the current situation. That is, in a sense, it is a big opportunity, but it is also, it has also difficulty, especially for the developing country government, because facing the higher fuel price and, especially under the COVID-19 situation, the budgetary situation of some developing countries, they worsen, so that there are no sufficient capacity, even though this higher price is a big opportunity to change the direction toward the decarbonization. The second is that some kind of integral, market rule, promoted by private sector might be a possible driver, but remind you that there might be a possible exclusion, especially the small and the medium company and the developing countries, such as the Asian developing countries. So that's I think these two directions have to go hand in hand. Without that, I think the cause a problem even in implementing climate actions.
Thank you. So I'm getting word from the organizers, we have to wrap up. We have to keep it within the time limits. So I want to thank you all very much for your insights and your perspectives, and for taking the time to join us today. Thank you. And Manjiao, I'll turn it back over to you to have the last word.
Thank you, Craig, for moderating this fabulous webinar. I would just echo to say thank you to the moderator and all our distinguished speakers for sharing your insights with all of us. And I believe that all of us have benefited immensely from your talk tonight. And I also specifically, I would like to thank our audience, the 14 and then 11. We don't have a big group of audience, but luckily, because this is part of the reason of time zones, and the recording will be broadcasted, available through YouTube and ASO website in the future. So it's still accessible, and we will have more viewers. The interest group will hold other webinars and activities in the future. So please stay with us, and I look forward to meeting many of you in the future. And thank you and goodbye.